Welcome to the Trent England Show. It's Thursday. I hope you are dry. If you're in the Oklahoma City area and you're watching us live, we had some pretty good storms just roll through the area. But we're here and glad to be here and glad to know that there are now more, for the first time since they've been recording this data, although they've only been recording this for less than 20 years, these particular numbers, but still, more job openings than there are people looking for work. That's a big deal. More job openings than there are people looking for work. We're gonna get back to that one in just a minute. I wanted to fill you in on something we've followed here and there, the twists and turns at Evergreen State College, which is like a miniature version of Berkeley that's based in Washington State, actually in Olympia, Washington, where I used to work for a number of years, and it is a wacky, wacky place. And it's important that we know what's going on there because it gives us a view, if we keep following the progressive leftists down the path, down the rabbit hole, it shows us where you can wind up. They had two professors at Evergreen State College last year who filed diversity complaints against each other. So they had this he said, she said. It was a female Hispanic professor and a white male professor, and they filed complaints against each other, and the school said, we don't want to deal with this ourselves. This is too hot to handle. We'll hire an expensive law. It's a state school. So they said, we'll hire an expensive Seattle law firm, and we'll outsource dealing with this kind of a challenge. And the law firm came back and said, we found discrimination at Evergreen State College. Lo and behold, there's actually racial discrimination at Evergreen State College, not against the Hispanic professor, but against the white professor. And what they found was this professor, who happens to be white, had been going through his performance review process, and everything was great, except that his supervisor had raised the issue of his race, and had actually said, well, we're not sure if students feel comfortable speaking up in your class simply because he's white. Right? Think about this. Now, look, what I'm not saying is boo-hoo, white people being discriminated against. I mean, this is discrimination against a professor based on the fact that he's white, but that's not really my point here, right? My point is something deeper and more important, right? I mean, think about the mentality of people out there who say, well, students, if a student is not white and the professor is white, then the student who's not white is going to inherently have a hard time talking in that classroom. Think about that mentality, right? Think about the kind of tribalism, the kind of pathos, the kind of society, balkanized society that drives us towards. And of course, that's exactly where the left wants to take us. Think about how, that is sick versus what they ought to be saying, right? And I'll say it on this program, trigger warning, if you're a student in higher education right now, you might need to turn this off because this might make you uncomfortable. But actually, you should watch it, especially if it makes you uncomfortable, because what they have to say, if they have a minority student who comes in and says, well, the professor's white, I feel uncomfortable in this class, you know what they ought to say? That's your problem. And we're here at college, at university, to actually fix that problem by forcing you to sit in a class with people with whom you disagree and deal with it. And if you can't deal with it, you're not college material. Go find something else to do. Right? Go waste your time somewhere else. That's what they ought to say. And the same thing to a student. If there's a student who's white who says, well, I can't, I feel uncomfortable in this classroom where the professor's not white, they should say the same thing. That's your problem. That's your personal problem. And if you want to operate in the real world, you've got to get over it. And we're not going to cater to it, not one iota, because that's not what college or universities, that's not what they're about, right? They're supposed to be about exactly the opposite of that. Especially, by the way, look, private colleges can do whatever they want. Evergreen State College in Washington State should be privatized, just like a lot of colleges and universities ought to be privatized. Because look, if they want to do their own thing, they can do their own thing, not on our dime, right? Public colleges, public universities actually have a duty to whom? To the public, right? They have a duty to the public to tell the young folks who show up there to get over their own personal problems and actually become functioning, productive members of society, or else go do something else, not on the taxpayer's dime, right? So anyhow, that is a story that shows us where the progressive leftists would take us, right? You can't have, I mean, basically this is, and this has been the issue at Evergreen State College. There are people there who believe you should have single race classrooms, right? I mean, this was the original issue. They said, well, all white people should leave campus for a day. Right? They're racists. These people are racists, right? I mean, they are the modern American racists, which is not to say there aren't white people who are racist too, right? But these folks are, these are the racists who get away with it. Okay, back to the job. Let's get back to some good news. More job openings than there are people looking for work. It's an interesting story because of what is not happening. One of the, I mean, let me give you the basic numbers here. There are 6.7 million in April. The economic data from April showed 6.7 million job openings. There's lag time. That's why it's June and we're talking about April. These numbers just came out recently. 6.7 job openings and 6.35 people looking for work. Unemployment is way down. But this is leading economists to ask, and a lot of other people to ask, a couple of basic questions. Why aren't wages going up? And why isn't unemployment going down even more? And it probably will continue to go down a little bit more. But you're also seeing less churn, fewer people leaving their jobs and looking for other jobs, which typically you see when you see unemployment so low and when you see so many job openings relative to the number of job seekers out there. Usually you see wages going up and more churn in the employment marketplace. And the fact is, the reason is, I haven't really seen this covered anywhere else. Some people have covered one fact, which is the baby boomers, right? You have people who retired maybe when they were planning to retire, maybe they retired early during the Great Recession or at some point in the wake of the Great Recession. They couldn't get another job. They adjusted their life to just be retired a little bit earlier than they had planned. That has taken some people out of the economy, some people off the playing field. You also have a lot of baby boomers who are still working, and you can't just replace somebody who's been doing a job for 10, 20, 30, 40, even 50 years with somebody who's right out of college, right? So there is potentially a kind of an inherent skills mismatch. You also see people out there talking about just the skills mismatch in general, that employers are not, if you go and you survey employers, it takes us back to talking about higher education, doesn't it? You go out and survey employers about the kind of workers, the kind of people who are applying for positions, and employers are not very happy right now because they find that a lot of workers aren't very good at showing up on time, aren't very good at writing and doing math and some of the basic things that we know. A lot of schools in Oklahoma aren't very good at producing graduates who can do those things, so no surprise there. But one of the other things that hasn't been talked about as much is the fact that our economy really has changed and is changing and is a place that is just tougher for certain groups of workers. It's not just a skills mismatch in general, it's a skills mismatch in particular areas, right? Where workers don't, they may have a job and there may be job openings, but workers don't necessarily feel confident about their ability to move up the ladder because we see so many more jobs in whether they're in the trades or whether they're professional jobs or knowledge workers or whatever you want to call it, where the skills required are very, very specialized. And I mean, this is where you just drive down a road, right? You see all kinds of signs advertising night MBA programs and other kinds of certificate programs, and it has become big business to try to provide people with additional skills once they're already out in the workplace to try to move up that corporate ladder. That business suggests one reason why workers are still facing challenges even in a very tight labor market. Nevertheless, right, one of the things that's a pet peeve of mine that here again, people never talk about this, is how much private business freeloads off of taxpayers for worker training, right? I mean, when you see OU doing an MBA program, you should think, we, the taxpayers who subsidize OU, are actually subsidizing a bunch of people out there in the working world. Look, you might think this is a good thing or a bad thing, but it's a fact that we ought to face. We're subsidizing job training for professionals who are already employed, right? And you see this in a lot of areas. You see this in career tech. I mean, and again, Oklahoma has a great career tech program. You may think this is a good thing or a bad thing, but private businesses would otherwise have to train people themselves to do the jobs that those private businesses need, right? They would be out there teaching people how to be mechanics, teaching people how to weld. Instead, they lobby the government to create programs to train their workers for them so that they can freeload off of taxpayers to get that, right? So again, I'm not saying that that's always a bad thing. I'm just saying it's something that we should think about more. As we think about the economy and we think about the skills mismatch that's out there, and maybe we should expect a little more out of private businesses, or at least not freak out when private businesses complain that there aren't enough people out there with who are certified welders. All right, well, go train some people to be certified welders, and then you'll have employees, right? Okay. Why should they expect that the public has to pay for all of that? Or, whatever. Okay. One of the other challenges that we face in the U.S. economy, we talked about things like licensing in the past. One of the ingredients for a successful economy is the rule of law and the stability that brings with it. The fact is, when people invest, when you have somebody out there and they say they've got an idea for a small business, the other ingredient, it's not just about an idea, it's not just about tenacity. The other ingredient is they need a level playing field that actually extends far out into the future. They need to have trust in the system. Trust is a necessary ingredient for a flourishing economic system. They need to trust that they can invest now and reap those gains, not just years, but decades into the future. One of the challenges that we find out there, and this is not as big a threat as a lot of regulations and licensing and things like that, but one of the challenges is civil asset forfeiture. The fact that government, through law enforcement, is able in some circumstances to just take money from people based on the suspicion that they committed a crime. I've talked about this on the program, but there's a story that just is out there in the press this week, and I just wanted to be sure that you have seen this. A family in Ohio, they are immigrants to the United States from Eastern Europe. They were getting ready to go back to Eastern Europe and spend 6 months there, and they were taking a lot of money. And this is something that some Americans have a hard time understanding, but people who grew up in certain other parts of the world are used to dealing in cash and saving money in cash because you couldn't trust the banks. You couldn't trust the financial institutions. You had to actually, they would actually keep their own cash, hold on to it, literally between, under the mattress. And sometimes when those people come to the United States, they do the same thing. So you have an older couple heading back to Eastern Europe, taking what amounted to about $50,000 in cash. They were going to buy a house to live in there, a vacation home for themselves, with this money that they had saved up. They were going to help some relatives there. This is not that uncommon of a story, and unfortunately, what's also not that uncommon is that when it was discovered by Immigration and Customs Enforcement officials that they had all this cash, the federal government just took it. They said, well, we think it's suspicious that you have this much money, and if it's suspicious, we can take it. And as I always say, I do not outsource, and I hope you do not outsource your moral judgment to the legal code. It is legal for them to do this. It is also theft. And the fact that it's legal does not make it any less theft than if it was done during the commission of a home invasion burglary, right? It's theft, no matter what. Whether it's done behind a badge or behind a knife, it's still stealing. I'll put the link up to that story. You should see that. St. Augustine said, there's no difference between a prince and a pirate, a political leader and a gang member, right? Other than that the politicians tend to be, maybe not in Oklahoma, but tend to be more organized, right? They're better organized. They have maybe more guns at their disposal than your gang leader has, right? And this is, St. Augustine said this. Right? There's no difference unless, the only difference is if you hold the political official, if you hold the prince, if you hold your elected legislators, if you hold law enforcement to a moral standard, that's the only difference. And if we do not hold them to a moral standard, if we just say, well, if it's legal, it's right, that's the same thing as saying, well, if the mafia don wants it, his will is the law within that system, then it's right. Then you have no standard of right and wrong other than force. And there's no difference between government and the mafia or, the police and gangs. And we should remember this when we talk about law enforcement policies, when we talk about other laws in general. And when we talk about the state of California, California is trying to better follow in the way of France, I think, by making sure that people in California don't shower every day. Is that true? I don't know if that's true actually about France. Is that true about France? Have you been to France? Like, is it true that people, like say, you hear these, you hear these rumors, but I will say I don't know if it's true. But in California, they have passed, and the governor has signed a law to make permanent the rationing of water in California, subject to fines of as much as $10,000 per day if you are in California and you violate your per person amount of water, which basically means, when you look at this, 55 gallons per person per day, dropping to 50 gallons per person per day within about 12 years, right? Well, think about this, right? A bathtub is about 80 gallons of water. So you can never take a bath in California ever again, right? But a shower for 8 minutes, right, is 17 gallons of water. That means a shower for the average teenager is about 60 gallons of water, right? I mean, so I mean, look, this is not, this is not like don't be excessive with your water use. This would mean that if somebody in California lived alone, they could not do laundry and take a shower on the same day. And if they did, and if they got caught, $10,000 fine, right? I mean, look, they have droughts in California sometimes. They have to ration water in California sometimes. This is permanent. This isn't about droughts. This is about control. Okay, last story. I love this one. This is really interesting to me. You can tell me if it's interesting to you or not. There's a new study that came out. Let me tell you what they did. Well, let me tell you what they found. There are scientists out there now saying that according to their best research, pretty much all of the species, about 90% of the species that exist on Earth right now today, all came into existence at the same time, roughly speaking, right? Which is very surprising to these scientists. One of the co-authors of this study said, I fought against this as hard as I could, but I can't get around it. That's what the evidence shows. What they did is, and this is great. Sometimes you see scientists doing science, which is really cool. They took a method, a really simple method of analyzing DNA in mitochondria, right? So this is a particular kind of DNA. This is actually what they use when you have meat inspectors and they go out to a hamburger plant and they discover that it's actually horse meat. This is what they do. They use this tool that is a very simple tool for looking at DNA and determining what species the DNA is from. So these scientists said, nowadays we've got these banks of animal DNA. They went and looked at 100,000 species DNA. All of these samples, they synthesized them all through this program, and they wanted to see what they would find. And what they expected to find was a lot of diversity and greater diversity over time. And if you know anything about DNA, you know that you can actually, if you look at a bunch of different DNA samples, you can create a kind of a backward-looking timeline of diversity changing over time. Diversity should be increasing over time according to these scientists' evolutionary theories. What they actually found was that species are very real, that the DNA signature for different species is very distinct, not just for human beings. We've known that about human beings for a long time, but about certain species of finches are very distinct from another species of finch, very distinct from a species of bacteria, right? All of this, it's kind of common sense to those of us who aren't scientists. This is very surprising to the scientists, and even more surprising is what I mentioned at the beginning of the story. It turns out that, as far as they can tell, pretty much all of the animal life that lives on Earth right now emerged all at exactly the same time. I share this story with you not to grind any particular axe. I share this story with you because it is such an important reminder that folks, specialists in any field, whether it's biologists, whether it's economists, claim to know all kinds of things that they don't really know. And the real scientists, the real experts are those who are willing to admit what they don't know, are those who are willing to do the research that actually disproves their own assumptions. And I love it when we see folks out there in a field like biology discovering that a lot of the things that they have believed about, say, something like evolutionary theory turn out to be poof, not true at all. And more questions for the scientists, the good scientists out there, the honest scientists to try to answer. We will follow that and all kinds of other things, I'm sure. On the Trent England Show, we got one more day this week. I hope you will join me tomorrow. Remember, you can find us. We're on iTunes. We're on the Google Play Music Store under podcasts. We're on SoundCloud, Stitcher, Facebook, Twitter at Trent England. And as always, you can find the whole show archive at ocpathink.org. Thanks for watching.